Hey guys, what's happening? This is Betaflight. In this video, I'm going to be updating the Omnibus F4 Pro to the latest Betaflight 3.1 software, and I'm also going to be using BlHeli Passthrough to update the ESCs to the latest version, which I believe is 16.6. I'm going to be plugging the quadcopter in at some point to the battery, so the first thing I'd always suggest you do is taking off the propellers. Next, after that, I'm going to be plugging in the USB port to the computer, and then we're going to cut to Betaflight on the computer now. So we open up Chrome and then click the app to open up Betaflight. From there, we're going to connect the board to the computer, so connect the quadcopter. First thing, I'm selecting the Omnibus F4, the SD version, because this version that I've got's actually got the SD card for logging. And then I pick the flash firmware that I want to use, load it up, and once I've done that, once it's loaded up, I'm going to connect the board in and hit flash firmware, and then it's going to load that up for a little bit of a while. Just bear in mind that this footage is sped up, so if you're doing this yourself, it might just take a little bit longer than mine is showing. Once it completes the flash, what I'm going to do is hit disconnect on the Betaflight software, and then just make sure I give the board a full reset. So I'm going to pull the USB and then load it back in and hit the connect button so I can start doing the initial setup on the board. The first thing I'm going to do here when I actually get into Betaflight is calibrate the accelerometer. To do that, all I do is I put the quadcopter on a nice flat stable surface, hit the calibrate accelerometer button, and just let it do its thing. I'm just going to check really quickly just to make sure that the board isn't actually turned around in the software, just by moving it around and just making sure, you know, forward is forward, side to side, and everything is doing exactly what it should be. Next is the ports page, and on this I changed the UART1 to serial RX so that I can set up S-Bus later on in the configuration tab that I'm going to go to next. Every time I do this, I'm just making sure that I am letting the board reboot. I'm doing a proper reset on the board, so I'm pulling the USB to make sure there's no power getting to the board, plugging it back in and then connecting it, but I'm going to remove that in the final edit. So on the configuration tab, the first thing that I do is actually change the motor protocol to DShot 600. I will be going back and switching this off when I do the update on the ESCs. After that, I'm setting the S-Bus protocol, just making sure that that's talking like it should be, and then I'm going to very quickly check that the voltage and current sensors are actually turned on and working. Final thing I'm going to do here really is update the PID loop frequency to 8 kHz. I tried this board slightly earlier on. It seemed to run it fine. The CPU load was very low when I was doing it, so that shouldn't be any sort of issue. And then I save and let that reset. On the receiver tab, I'm just going to up the deadbands a little bit and leave it there for now. I'll come back to it later on. Now the F4 Pro, this Omnibus F4 Pro actually has an on-screen display built in, as well as current and voltage sensors. So I'm going to be configuring that really quickly in the on-screen display. I'm setting things like my alarms for capacity to 1300, which is pretty much what I run all my batteries at, and dropping the flight time to about 8 minutes for the alarm. I'm not too worried about setting the screen up too much in terms of actually what's on it where, because I'm going to have to go back and actually just fine-tune that with the goggles later on just to make sure everything's actually visible. Later on, I actually found that this Omnibus F4 Pro doesn't actually show probably the last 4 or 5 lines of this display. So where I'm setting them to now, you just couldn't see anything. I had to push it up about maybe 5 lines to actually get any sort of thing on the bottom of the screen. Going back to the receiver tab, I'm just making sure that all my channels are pretty well centered. I'm just making sure the min and max numbers are all what they should be, and then just checking where all my AUX lines are pushing out to, just making sure that I can set the switches and everything up. On the PID tuning tab, I'm going to be tuning this up later on, but I'm just pushing up the proportional figures just a little bit, and I'm trying to get the roll rates to about 1200 degrees a second, which is about where I tend to run a lot of my quadcopters at. And then I'll just set the throttle expo just so it's a little bit more controllable low down when I'm hovering. Next thing, we're going to be working on the modes tab. I'm going to do a few setups on this one. First one is going to be the arm switch, and I'm just setting it to the top 2 positions of the AUX1. I want to have the air mode set to the top end of the arm switch as well, so I get to choose between having air mode on and off halfway up, so I can basically idle it without it going crazy and trying to jump off the floor and things like that. Next thing, we're going to have the AUX2 to set between the different flight modes. So I'm just having a stabilized version and then having the other two positions as basically like an acro sort of rates mode. Once I've done that, I'm going to enable expert mode so that I can get to the failsafe settings. I just want to make sure everything is doing what it should do. I basically want to be able to drop that arm button and have the quad switch off immediately. Likewise, if I lose reception from the transmitter, I want that quad to turn off and basically fall out the air so that no one's actually going to get hurt. I've tested the D-Shot at this point, and I've found that everything's working just fine with the D-Shot 600 with the modifications that I've made to the ESCs. So what I'm going to do now is set it back to one-shot 125, save and then disconnect it, and then I'm going to hop over to BlHeli suite and open that up so that then I can flash and update the ESCs to the latest version of the software. It's always a good idea to download the latest version of the software if you can as well. They've always got a new one out. Every time I've been there, there's been something new. At this point, I'm going to select the Scilab's BlHeli bootloader with clean flight, so that's going to activate the pass-through. And then you'll see I start by clicking read setup, and it doesn't actually give me anything because I haven't selected the right COM port. But once I do, I actually get it registering that there is something on the other end. I've made sure that once I've booted up this BlHeli suite, I've actually activated the quad, so I've plugged it in, and that's giving power to the ESCs. And that way when I tell it to read setup, it's actually telling me exactly what I've got going. You'll notice that my ESCs aren't actually in sync if you look closely. That's basically because I'm using the software to actually change the motor direction to keep the build quite nice and clean. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly run off a screenshot of the ESC overview just to make sure after I update it that the settings are basically the same, so I'm getting the same motor direction. Obviously I'll check this separately, but it's useful to do it before and after, I find. So the final thing to do really is just to flash the latest firmware to the ESCs. This is really simple. All you need to do is click Flash BlHeli. Once you've got everything plugged in, it'll automatically ask you if you want to flash the latest revision, and just select that, hit yes. It's going to write the flash through, and then from there it'll say that it's actually finished and successfully installed. And once you've done that, it's going to ask you if you want to copy your settings over if they're valid, and then it'll ask if you want to do the others from there. So I'm just going to run through them all and just let them copy the settings over and everything. Obviously this is sped up a little bit, so it'll probably take a little bit longer when you choose to do this. It is really worth making sure that you solder both the signal and the ground line to the ESCs when you do this, because it's going to make your life far simpler if you want to use pass-through. From there, I'm going to go back into the Betaflight configurator, head over to the configuration tab, and then on the ESC motor protocol, I'm changing that from one-shot 125 down to D-Shot again, and then changing the motor idle throttle value to 4% rather than the stock 3%, just making sure that's all set right. Once I've done this, I'm going to go back down to the motors tab and just test that the motors are still spinning in the correct directions. So everything was absolutely fine with the motors tab. I also went back and just made sure that all of my settings were okay on the receiver and everything. I just double checked everything I'd done basically, but I didn't want to show you guys that again. From there, we're pretty much ready to fly the quad. So last thing I'm going to do is pop the propellers back on, making sure that I've got them in the right direction, so right props for the direction that they're actually spinning, and then it'll be on to the next video for tuning and testing. Thanks for watching, guys, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, because I'm going to have a lot more coming to you from now on.